Second talk, delivered by me in the same place to a much increased assemblage. Last time, in the second half of my talk, I spoke about the supposition crystallized in me regarding the probable causes of the arising, as a result of wrongly interpreted ideas of mine, of a very undesirable particularity in the general psyche of people from various independent groups. Today, I shall begin my explanations about the same, but exclusively in regard to you Americans previously composing as well as presently belonging to this group of people who have also become followers of my ideas. Now, I want to present on this subject, after my special observations and investigations during these last days, an already completely determined opinion regarding just how and in what sequence were formed also among you here the conditions for the crystallization in your psyche of that pernicious factor, on account of which now, in most of you, to my sincere regret, instead of finding, in comparison with other people, data of a higher level, which obligatorily ought to have been formed during this time in you, as people who happened prematurely to come in contact with the truths learned by me through my half-century's conscientious labors, almost incomprehensible for contemporary people, which give the possibility and chance to every man to obtain the being of a real man. There is formed, as I can now impartially constate, something quite contrary. Frankly speaking, almost every one of you gives the impression of, and really is, a man who has all the data to become at any moment a client of one of those, on an American scale, organized houses in New York which are called madhouses, and which are supported here by the followers of the English suffragettes. For you Americans, the arising of this evil which formed itself in connection with my ideas began and gradually took a definite form thanks to the following events. When, as I've already said, at the beginning of the second year of the existence of the Institute in France, I was compelled to take the decision, without waiting for the complete preparation of the material for demonstrations, to travel immediately to you Americans in order that here, among you, types still foreign to me, I should not be compelled to live on beans mixed with thumbtacks, with such a large number of people indispensable for the realization of the aims I had in view, each of whom, in my misfortune, as well as later on to the misfortune of many of your compatriots, who have become through them the objects of my periodic chief specialty, which is to shear half the wool of every near corner, was at that period subject to a disease, which in the psyche of the patient evokes, among other things, the habit of having in his pockets exclusively a louse on a leash, in one or in the other a flea on a chain. I considered it a necessary preliminary then, in order that at least something might be prepared here in New York for the arrival of such great numbers of people, to send there, on the last boat sailing just before ours, someone from among my trusted and experienced people. In consequence of the fact that just a short time before this, most of my pupils of the first rank, as they called themselves, who were suitable for the purpose, had been sent by me for aims in the common interest to various European and Asiatic countries on special missions. My choice, from among those who were near me, of the most suitable person for this preliminary departure, fell upon one of the older followers of my ideas, who was then the chief physician of the Institute, Dr. Stjernvall. But as at that time he was not at all acquainted with the English language, I decided to send together with him as assistant and translator one of my newly entered English pupils. Examining in my mind and considering the usefulness of each one separately for such a journey, I decided to send just this pupil from the number of those newly entered in the Institute, who, according to the so-called individual record, usually made in the Institute for each pupil, was previously an English journalist, and I thought, as a journalist, ought surely to know English very well. This former English journalist, predetermined by me at first to be a translator and assistant of the first person sent by me to America, as, so to say, messenger of my new ideas, Dr. Stjernball, and who a little later became the collaborator and my personal translator, Monsieur Ferapontov, a pupil of the Institute and a participant in the demonstrations of rhythmic movements, who, toward the end of my stay here, became one of the three, as they were then called, managers, that is to say, organizers of demonstrations, lectures, and business interests with different people I had to see, was nobody else than that man who, on account of fortuitous circumstances, arising partly from the catastrophe which happened to me and partly from the consequences of that abnormality at the basis of family life, crystallized in the life of contemporary people, especially in you Americans, which consists in the fact that the leading role in the household belongs to the woman, afterwards became your chief leader. I speak, as you yourself surely have already guessed, of Mr. Orage. All the following, which led to the sad results that are the subject of our talk today, arose in the following successiveness. When, at the end of my first visit to America, after a rather successful realization of all my plans, I was ready to go back to Europe with the intention, as I said then, to return in 6 months, for the purpose of already opening permanent branches of the Institute in some of your big cities, and several days before my departure, I was discussing aloud, together with the people who came with me, who could be left here for the continuation of what had begun, as well as various other preparations for my next intended arrival. Mr. Orage, being present as well, unexpectedly offered his services, and with great excitement began to affirm his ableness to do it brilliantly. As I found him quite suitable for the necessary preparations, chiefly on account of his proven knowledge of the English language, of which I had been convinced already here in New York, as well as on account of his smart appearance, which, as might be easily understood, has a great importance in all business transactions, especially among you Americans, I accepted his offer, and began to explain to him at once certain details of the required preparations. As I learned afterwards, the real cause of his offer and his enthusiasm was that during our stay in New York he had started a romance, which at this time was at its apogee, with a saleswoman of that bookshop with the very original name, Sunwise Turn, where I began there in New York, among a very small number of your compatriots, according to my habit, to hold meetings in the form of lecture talks, answering, among other things, different questions which were asked me regarding my ideas. Well then, as I've already said, on my return to Europe after my sojourn among you at the end of the first week, there occurred to me that motor accident, as a result of which for over 3 months I entirely lost my memory and powers of combination, and then for 6 months more lay in a semi-conscious state, half controlling these two fundamental capacities on which depend and which generally impose responsibilities on the individuality of man. And when, as a consequence of all this, a great crisis arose in all my affairs, gradually taking proportions which announced a complete catastrophe, then I, just at the beginning of this said second period of my physical state, still quite helpless in body and kept in bed, clearly realizing in lucid intervals of my consciousness the created situation, began on the one hand to give orders and take all kinds of measures for the most rapid liquidation of everything connected with the Institute, on account of the constantly required great expense, with a complete lack of revenues, and also the absence among the people round me of a businessman, and on the other hand to invent all kinds of combinations for the regulation of innumerable misunderstandings, arising thanks to the mentioned liquidation, as well as to the pernicious manifestations of various types usually proceeding, as I have said, among degenerated people of our class. Then, by the way, once, just in that period when the functioning of my usual powers of combination began to be re-established from time to time, and I could realize clearly what had happened and imagine different possibilities as a way out of the situation that had been created, one of the people near me, who at that time acted as my financial minister, addressing himself to me about one financial embarrassment, the solving of which was above his capacities, said to me that just that day he had received from America, from Mr. Orage, $1,000, adding that it was the third time that he had received such a sum, and that it always came most appropriately. In the following months, as my state was still almost without change, and during the mentioned lucid periods, I could hardly discuss the affairs regarding the liquidation or find diverse combinations for the purpose of getting out of the desperate situation which had been created. I entirely forgot about Mr. Orage and his kind solicitude in regard to me and my work. Only a year after the mentioned talk about money sent by Mr. Orage from America, when I had more or less liquidated all the dangers of the advancing catastrophe, and the state of my health had improved, I found out that these sendings from Mr. Orage, though diminished, still continued, and that some of your compatriots participated in them. Just then I at once changed my mind regarding my first decision to shut the doors of my house to all people, making an exception for you Americans composing just this group, as well as for all Americans who showed an interest in my ideas. And from then on, not only were the doors of my house always open for you, but with some of you, about whose real interest in my ideas I was informed beforehand, by somebody who had already proved his faithfulness in the sense of real interest in my ideas, I, as much as my deep occupation with serious questions of my writings would permit, was always willing to have talking relations also. As regards the immediate cause for the formation in your mentation of the mentioned idée fixée, which served in its turn as a factor for the gradual crystallization in your psyche of the mentioned specific particularity, all that, as I represent it to myself now, after detailed confrontations and, so to say, statistical deductions, based on personal inquiries of several members of this very group, as well as others near to them, probably happened in the following way. Mr. Orage, who was left by me in America, and who was occupied at first only by fulfilling errands regarding my projected second visit, after the catastrophe which occurred to me, while very much captivated by my ideas, and still not yet completely under the influence of his left-shoulder angel, when he learned of all that had occurred to me, at once began profiting from the strong impression, still continuing by inertia, which I had made on your compatriots, and for several months began to collect money and to send a part of it to me at the Prieuré. And at the same time, obviously with the aim of giving an external justification to these collections, he began, without my permission for it, to direct the classes for rhythmic movements organized by me here in New York. Furthermore, realizing the necessity and at the same time all the difficulties of getting means on the one hand for sending money to me, and on the other hand for meeting the excessive expenditures of his new family life, as by this time his romance had ended in his marrying the saleswoman of Sunwise Turn, a young American pampered out of all proportion to her position. He began, for the purpose of increasing his resources, to organize, as was usual in the Institute life, talks on themes which he had learned during his stay in the Institute. When all this material had been used by him, not receiving either any new material or any definite indication from me as to what to do or how to proceed further, he had willy-nilly to get along during this time merely with what he had assimilated during his stay in the Institute while still in the capacity of an ordinary pupil, and with this very limited knowledge to, so to say, manipulate in every way. As I only recently elucidated to myself during my present sojourn here, by acquiring some of your comrades who were members, from the beginning, of the group which Mr. Orage directed, he, like a good juggler, managed with only the primary information out of the whole totality of information, throwing light on all my ideas, which concerned that question about which I spoke in the last lecture, that is to say, the question of so-called self-observation. Namely, with the summarized elucidation of this information, the knowledge of which is indeed quite indispensable at the beginning for everyone who is striving to learn the truth, but which, if it becomes the center of gravity for the mentation of man, will, as was long ago established and verified by me, unfailingly lead to just the result which, to my regret, I observe now in almost every one of you. This situation, created at the beginning of my writing activity on account of the catastrophe which occurred to me, continued until the present time. Now, after an interruption of 7 years in the application in life by successive stages of the mentioned detailed program which had become the aim and sense of my life, having finally finished this principal and most difficult task, which required constantly all my attention and all my self-imposed efforts, during these years, I want, simultaneously with fulfilling the easier part of my task, to renew the actualization of this aim of mine by this time, with the help of the results obtained during these past years from my constant intensive labors realized in 10 big volumes. Namely, I intend to continue to give a final polishing to my writings, in order to make them accessible to the understanding of every average man, and, while doing this work, in the same conditions as before, that is to say, writing in various cafes, restaurants, and other public places, always traveling, to begin simultaneously with this to make these accidental or intentional sojourns to different centers of contemporary civilization, which satisfy the required conditions, the preparation of the soil for the organization of the clubs mentioned by me last time. As my present visit here coincides with the moment for creating conditions which will give me the possibility of undertaking the realization of my plans, I have therefore decided during the period of my stay here among you to devote all the time left after the fulfillment of my fundamental task to the organization and opening of the first club of this kind. The opening here in New York, with the participation of people composing this group of yours, of the first branch, not only in North America but in general on Earth, of the main club, which will be in France at the Château de Prieuré, will be, in my opinion, in all respects,
right and objectively just.
It will be right and just because the Americans, chiefly you who compose this group, besides having been for a long time in contact with my ideas, were the only ones who proved to be grateful to me during the hard years of crisis, and you were also the only ones with whom I had personal relations, after the misfortune which occurred to me when I gave myself fully to my new profession as a writer, and broke all relationships I had previously had with the people of every rank and class in various European states, of course excluding my relations with the employees of various cafes and restaurants. Well then, my friends imposed by destiny, in spite of my most natural, sincere desire, which must be clear to you, that the first branch of the fundamental kernel of such a first institution connected with my ideas should be organized just here among you, I, impartially analyzing with my consciousness all the past and confronting certain obvious facts, cannot fulfill in peace such a wish dear to my nature. The cause of such a contradiction in my general inner state is my clear understanding of the fact that some of you, perhaps on account of always being such, or on account of various misunderstandings which took place in the past years in the internal life of your group, do not correspond at all to the requirements which must be put before the members of this first institution proposed to be organized here, namely, such an institution which, in my opinion, must have, for the future, a very important character of general human significance. During the time of my presence here among you, more than once I seriously thought about the situation which had been created, but failed to find a definite way out of it. And only today, when it appeared clear that I shall be obliged to come here again next year, on account of some business which has no connection whatever with you, and I realized, besides, that I should be for at least 1 year or even more occupied with questions concerning my writings, I took a categorical decision to postpone the organization of these clubs until next year, and to devote all the time left of my present stay among you entirely to the personal reorganization of your group. In this sense, to introduce into its internal life principles corresponding to my ideas, which must unfailingly be actualized and which could contribute, in the general psyche of some of you, to the accelerated crystallization of corresponding data for the possibility of being deemed worthy of becoming, by the time of my visit to you next year, competent kernel-composing members of the said first institution. And principles which contribute in the general psyche of others, data for a sincere confession of their unworthiness to be members of this first model institution, with the result that they, having understood this, withdraw themselves. In other words, to consecrate all my free time, first to establishing personally in the required tempo everything corresponding to a right work, with the person whom I intend to send to you for directing everything that is necessary for that attainment, in strict accordance with my ideas of my fixed aims. And second, to purify your group of those elements which in the existing conditions not only cannot gain any profit for themselves, but may, for the formation as well as the actualizing of the general aim in this newly formed group, be very, very pernicious. The second part of this plan designed by me, that is to say, the purification of undesirable elements from your group, will manifest itself from the very beginning of the formation of this new group, because there will be placed before its members, among other things, several very definite conditions, allowing of no compromise whatsoever, to which in all probability not all of you will be able to agree. And in this way some of the members of the former group will naturally fall away. 13 such unfailingly required obligatory conditions for the right to be a member of this new group during the first months of its existence will be laid down by me. 7 of these will be of objective character, that is to say, will concern everyone, and must be fulfilled by all without exception. And 6 will be of subjective character, that is to say, will concern personally those of the former members of the old group, for whom personally these conditions will be made. Concerning the subjective conditions, it must be said that their character will ensue from the elucidations I have already made, or still intend to make, either myself or through those whom I shall commission, concerning the specific subjectivity of each of you, formed owing to a certain kind of psychic data, arisen thanks to typicality, heredity, and also acquired during the period of equal rights membership in the former group. Detailed explanation of the significance of all 13 conditions and the explanation of the motives logically justifying the necessity of these conditions will be given by me in advance exclusively to those members of the former group who agree to and bind themselves under a special oath, the form of which I shall indicate partly at once, partly later on, to fulfill exactly the first of the aforementioned
7 objective conditions.
Having said this, I called my secretary and dictated to him the following. I, undersigned, after mature and profound reflection, without being influenced by anyone else at all, but of my own free will, promise, under oath, not to have, without instructions from Mr. Gurdjieff or a person officially representing him, any relations whatsoever, spoken or written, with any of the members of the former group, existing till now, under the name of Oraj's group, of the followers of Mr. Gurdjieff's ideas, and also not to have any relations, without the special permission of Mr. Gurdjieff or his substitute, with Mr. Oraj himself. I am to have relations exclusively with those members of the former group, a list of whose names will be given to me during the general meetings of the newly formed exoteric group. Having read aloud the text of this obligation, I said, finishing today with this our meeting, I will merely add the following. Those of you who, as is said in the text of the paper I have just read, agree, after mature and profound reflection, to sign this paper, must do so before 12 o'clock noon the day after tomorrow, in the presence of my secretary translator. As to when and where the first general meeting of this new exoteric group will be held, all those who have signed the paper by the time set will be informed in due course.